Now it is the part of the show where I spend half an hour. We call it Hitchens Half Hour. I spent an enjoyable 30 minutes in the company of Mail on Sunday columnist Peter Hitchens. Welcome, Peter.
Thanks for having me.
Now, you had a busy day in the paper yesterday. You had a couple of pieces, of course, your regular column, and you also read a separate piece about the Taiwan-China crisis. We'll get to that in a little while. But in your main column, you led on something, and I remember when you were writing about this back in the dark days of the depths of the lockdown. In early March 2020, you wrote, "Our economy is still crippled, and the overpraised Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, like some beaming Dr. Feelgood with a case full of dodgy stimulants, seeks to soothe the pain by huge injections of funny money. He will get this back from us as soon as we are allowed out again. Just you wait till you get the bill in increased taxes, inflation and devastated savings." You were kind of right, weren't you?
I was right, yes, and it was not difficult to be right. Primary school economics would tell you all these things if the government behaved as it behaved. And of course, if this had been justified, then you would stand back and say, well, okay, then it had to be done and we had to pay the price for it. But as it happens, the evidence keeps on piling up that shutting down the major economies of the world and shutting down daily life did not, in fact, do any good. It was a wholly disproportionate response to a genuine problem, but a wholly disproportionate response. And it was useless. It's the interesting thing, quite useless to say anything about it at the time. Except in that I know from my correspondence and from the people I meet on the street and all kinds of other things that quite large numbers of people, nothing like a majority, but a considerable minority of people felt that this was a serious mistake, but that their case was not being made in Parliament or anywhere else, and for that they were grateful that somebody in public was at least saying it. But that's all the good it did. And I get this all the time. I mean, I learnt the other day, I take, as you know, a dissenting position on the Ukraine war. And I hear more and more from people who say they dare not, at work or in company, voice similar disagreements because they know they will just be shouted down by a conformist tide. We really are living in a remake of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, in which anybody who hasn't been taken over is immediately targeted by those who have, and they're all pointing at them and shouting at them. It's almost impossible to have a rational debate about anything these days once the stampede has begun.
Yeah, I remember during the lockdowns, I remember thinking, I mean, I'm not particularly economically astute, but I remember thinking, how can this be? You look around this country, you know, these boarded up high streets, no businesses functioning, no pubs opening, no restaurants, sort of tumbleweed hurtling down the streets, this derelict country, basically. I said, surely there's going to be a price to pay for this now. Of course there is, and we're finding that out now. And if nothing else, I mean, I don't think we should, I'll just about excuse them the first lockdown because they didn't quite know what was going on. I could never understand why they kept locking down time and time again. And worse than that, as you say, our overpriced then Chancellor, why did he keep extending the extraordinarily expensive furlough scheme? Was it purely to be popular?
Well, I think he didn't dare stop. It was politically dangerous for him to stop. I remember this was a government which had spent the whole of the previous election saying that Jeremy Corbyn was relying on the existence of a magic money tree, proposing to spend money that didn't exist, and this was a stupid and crazy policy. And they'd U-turned into doing exactly what they'd accused him of going to do. And they were riding a bicycle on a tightrope. If they were claiming that they were saving the country. And some of them must have begun to wonder, and some of their advisors must have begun to tell them this is really going to have very serious consequences. The only thing they could do was continue to pretend that this is worth doing. All of this was undermined at the time. There are other more complicated examples, but I'll stick to this one because it works. The problem at the time and since has been that Sweden, which did not behave in this fashion, did not go down the plumbing, did not have hecatombs of deaths, and has an economy in a much better state than ours is following all this. And it was perfectly possible to behave differently. And it must be very annoying to all those countries which plunged themselves into voluntary self-harm. As I always put it, burning down the house to get rid of a wasp's nest. It must be really annoying to them to see the one major country which did not do this not suffering as a result, but that is so.
Yes, and they go to great pains to say, oh, well, you can't compare Sweden to Britain. Well, you can, actually.
You can, very directly, and the comparison works very well. The thing is, will we learn the lesson from this, or will the official version that we didn't lock down hard enough and soon enough become the standard explanation of what happens? If so, the next time we'll do the same, and then we will have to cope 2 years afterwards with fantastically deep economic damage of the kind from which countries seldom recover.
And when they say, oh, we didn't lock down hard enough or soon enough, as if we'd have 3 weeks earlier of lockdown, we'd have never had a COVID crisis. Absolute rubbish. Ask the people of New Zealand, the long-suffering residents of that hermit kingdom, which now have a much worse COVID problem than many other countries. They locked down.
It's extraordinary what we did. It was collective madness. My only concern now is, having gone through it, is to try and get people to learn a proper lesson from it while there is still time before we have our next panic. But the next panic, of course, will take a different form. Each of these things comes along. There was the ludicrous overreaction to September the 11th and the absurd security measures taken for travellers, which still persist, though they're largely irrational. Do you remember the ash cloud?
Yes.
Right, the fascinating thing was, I seem to remember the head of British Airways begging to be allowed to take a plane up with other volunteers to go and see if there was actually any ash in the air, and they wouldn't let him go up. And the reason why I think they wouldn't let him go up, because he would have found there was
it established there wasn't any ash in the air.
But again, the whole of Europe was closed.
Because it was an Icelandic
to express any doubt about this panic at the time was again pretty much to be assumed to be around the bend. You cannot dissent these days, and one of the reasons you cannot dissent in modern Britain is because of the destruction of our education system 60 years ago now. We used to have an actual elite of people who'd been trained to think, and now we don't, and so everybody runs with the herd.
Well, we'll get onto that in a little while. I totally agree with you. Somehow or other, somewhere down the line, our education system forgot to tell kids how to debate, how to have civilized arguments. So now when they disagree with anyone, they start insulting them and scream and shout. We've lost the ability for civilized debate, and when you lose that, you lose a lot. We're also going to lose our traditional prosperity, I think, pretty badly. You talk in your column about just how bad this cost of living crisis is going to get, and that in fact people don't really have a concept of the abyss into which we're staring.
I noticed that Trevor Kavanagh, my old former colleague who's an industrial correspondent, said in The Sun today, compared it to the crisis of 1929, 1931. This is the thing which haunts me. Again, nobody's taught history of this kind anymore. But in that period, the Labour government of Ramsay MacDonald got themselves into the most tremendous, catastrophic economic mess. The Labour Party split, the government fell. We had, as a result, almost 15 years of what was called the national government, and a terrible crisis of unemployment and general decay. People simply didn't realise what had hit them. The thing which triggered the collapse of the pound sterling, for instance, was a mutiny in the Royal Navy.
Yes,
amazing events, and it's all forgotten. These very instructive moments in our national history are not taught anymore. It's either Hitler or Henry VIII and nothing else.
Do you think that we could persuade our politicians, Rishi and the gang, Boris even, to concede that their depiction of this problem all being down to the Ukraine war is not entirely accurate?
Well, I doubt it, because but on the other hand, why would they say this, given that they're so keen on embroiling us in this thing? Now, you may have whatever view you have about the borders between Ukraine and Russia and how that should be arranged. I don't know, and I'm not going to go into it, but the fact is it's not a major British preoccupation and never has been. So why Britain, of all the countries in Europe, is so deeply embroiled in this, what seems to be basically a quarrel between Russia and America, in which Ukraine is used as a chessboard, I don't know. But they're very keen on it, and they're spending lots of money on it, and they're completely opposed to any moves towards a compromised peace on it, which might avoid the terrible energy difficulties which are going to come from it, particularly from the autumn onwards. I don't understand it. I simply don't understand what it is that drives them, apart from some dreadful sycophancy towards the United States. I love the United States. I lived there for 2 years. I like Americans. It's a great country. It has much to be said in its favor. I'm glad it's the major power in the world as opposed to China or the old Soviet Union. But they aren't actually our friends. They will do what they want regardless of what we think. And the idea that we will make them our friends by tailing on after them in every international move they make is a mistake.
I'm going to get to... I guess America, China and Taiwan after the break. Just before we go to break, though, something I didn't sort of flag up to you, but it occurs to me you might have a thought on it. I'm a bit worried about so we've got this, what you and I might call nice weather, which apparently now is a signal for us all to say the end of the world is nigh, Britain is on fire, climate change is going to kill us all. But it seems to have opened the floodgates to a sort of blizzard of tyrannical orders from the authorities. Don't use your hose pipes, sneak on your neighbours, don't have barbecues, bath with a friend.
There certainly is a tendency towards authoritarianism, but there's an interesting paradox in this for the water companies. The last time this happened, people didn't have water meters. And so the water companies were quite keen to have hosepipe bans. Now they've got water meters. If they have hosepipe bans, water consumption will drop and their income will drop. And this apparently is an explanation as to why so many water companies are being so slow off the mark imposing.
Right?
So there are other things going on as well, but there is definitely a drive towards dobbing people in and ordering people about, which of course reached its height during the COVID panic. But we could easily be much worse than that, it seems to me.
Yes, George Eustace, the DEFRA minister, he doesn't seem to understand how to court popularity. I mean, I'm
not sure it was ever his strong point.
Yes, I mean, it's just calling for more hosepipe bans. This is just people watering their lawns and their roses.
Yes, it is, but I think there is... but the other thing people don't address, I mean, there are many reasons for this, and obviously the current weather is one of them, but the other is we have a much, much bigger population than we used to have.
Yes.
And we have not improved our infrastructure to cope with it. On the contrary, the whole history of what's happened to the water companies since privatisation is an absolute disgrace of them being milked of money which they didn't really have, while not doing anything to upgrade either the reservoirs or the pipes, or build what I've always thought was the ideal solution to this, which is a national water carrier connecting the north and the south, because the north generally has much more water than the south, so that these things could simply be evened out. That would be a piece of national investment worth doing, far more worthwhile than HS2, for instance, but no one even considers it.
Yes, I agree. And perhaps we could appoint a drought minister like we did in 1976, Dennis Howell, who actually bucked the trend for politicians not doing anything practical. He did a rain dance. That's what we need.
I had always thought the national rain dance was called the Wimbledon Fortnight, but it didn't seem to work this year.
Yeah, no, it didn't this year. Peter, we've just discussed your column, your excellent column yesterday, but you had another big piece in the paper headlined, "If the West is to resist China, we'll need subtler weapons than bluster over Taiwan." Explain.
Well, I think a lot of what's happened over the past few days, particularly the visit of the Speaker of the United States House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, to Taiwan, has strengthened China's position. They now feel much more able to be aggressive towards Taiwan than they did before, because they feel the United States has broken the rules that they have of quietly accepting that basically China will ultimately rule Taiwan, which is what China intends. We have, over the past, since 1949, when the Chinese seized Tibet, we've retreated and retreated in the face of Chinese aggression. The whole agreement which followed the Nixon in China trip over Taiwan was basically that the Western countries would stop recognizing it. We don't have an embassy there. They don't have an embassy here. Even the Americans dare not officially have an embassy in Taiwan. They have some sort of office with a fancy name, which is in effect an embassy, but they dare not recognize it as an independent country because it would annoy the Chinese so much. We've completely given in over Hong Kong, where the Chinese promised that for many years they would keep the country democratic and free. They've blatantly broken that agreement. What have we done? Nothing. And they can see that we're weak, even down to this bizarre thing where we all grovelingly call the Chinese capital Beijing instead of Peking, just entirely to please them. I never do, for that reason. They actually put pressure on Western newspapers to do it. They told the Times of London that if they didn't stop calling it Peking, they'd withdraw cooperation. Well, just imagine what would happen if we called in the French and told Le Monde that if they carried on calling London Laundry, we'd stop cooperating. That's such rubbish. But the Chinese get away with this. They're such bullies, and we're such cringers. And so they see this, and they know perfectly well that ultimately Taiwan will see this as well and will recognise that its position is indefensible, and some sort of deal will be come to. If we actually want to resist the expansion of Chinese power, then bluster will not do it. You look at the way in which our universities are selling themselves to China, the way in which an awful lot of opinion makers have been defenders of China, how close David Cameron got to China when he was Prime Minister. An example I came up with of an academic in New Zealand who's very good on China, who actually had her office mysteriously burgled and generally came under attack, and that she didn't get much defence from her colleagues or from the New Zealand government when this happened, because they're afraid of China too. It's a very strong, pervasive power, and you aren't going to get over it by saying, "Ooh, we're terribly strong." I challenge the Western world, if it really believes that this kind of drum beating will work, to invite Taiwan to join NATO. If they really mean it. Well, of course they won't do that.
Yeah, and while they're at it, get Ukraine to join NATO.
Well,
since we back Ukraine all the way.
Here's an interesting thing about that. NATO membership does not prevent its members from coming to the aid of countries which aren't in NATO. It obliges them to do the other thing, but all the NATO members could send forces into Ukraine if they wanted to. The reason they don't do it is not because the Ukraine isn't in NATO, it's because they don't want to.
What do you make of Nancy Pelosi's visit? Because I think it's quite clear the reason for it was, a lot of people said it was banal and unnecessary. Well, in a way, I agree with that. But the reason for it was that she's trying to improve the fortunes of the Democrats back in America, because they can't do anything right domestically. So she's trying to look tough on the world stage so they don't take quite such a hammering in the midterms.
I would imagine so. I mean, most things in American politics are now to do with midterms, whether it be the killing of the 19th in command of Al Qaeda in Kabul or whatever it is. It's all to do with electoral politics, and the midterms preoccupy, because generally the Democrats do badly in the midterms because their voters don't turn out.
Joe Biden, when they killed al-Zawahiri last week, just coincidentally, just a couple of days before Nancy arrived in Taiwan, lots of shows of international strength there. What with the midterms coming up, so they killed that guy, and Joe Biden said in his John Wayne, if you threaten our citizens, we will take you out. He said this was to keep Americans safe, and then issued an immediate warning that they had to be very, very careful now, because there would definitely be a reprisal terrorist attack. How does that keep Americans safe? I don't know.
It's the whole thing has always seemed to me to be quite bizarre. Also, especially given that the United States got itself embroiled with organisations affiliated to Al Qaeda in Syria, which is supported.
Yes.
So can we please make up our minds? Is Al Qaeda an enemy of the United States or an ally? Because they don't seem to be able to decide. It's an absurdity, much of this.
Yeah, and maybe if America hadn't pulled out of Kabul in the humiliating way that it did, they wouldn't need to have killed that.
Or maybe if the Americans hadn't armed the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in the first place, they might. I mean, once you go on, if so and so. But did you ever see Charlie Wilson's War?
Yeah, I did.
Incredibly good film, and on that very subject, I think, not
Tom Hanks, right? Yeah, good film. Yes,
great film.
Now, before you go, you've been involved in a Twitter spat. We all love those. I've had a few myself. Yeah. Congratulations for not yet getting cancelled over it. But it was about. You will be. Don't worry. Grammar schools. What was the nature of the row?
With Michael Rosen, whom I've known for many, many years, and who I actually quite like. But I said something. I've launched this new symbol. I'm bringing out a book in the autumn about.
Oh yeah.
Schools. The symbol is designed to represent the traditional education prohibited, except of course for the children of the rich and powerful, who can still have it, which has been what's happened as a result of the closure of state grammar schools since the 1960s. And one of the things I launched this, and Michael Rosen pitched in and said, well, I suppose you need a symbol about how you want to bring back secondary moderns or something along those lines. And I said, well, actually, secondary moderns, which everybody says were a disastrous kind of school you went to if you didn't go to grammar school, have been maligned. And in fact, towards the end of their existence, they were doing quite well. And it's my view that in many cases they were better than the comprehensives which replaced them. We know that none of the defenders of comprehensives seriously argue that the grammar schools were not good schools. They say the price for having them was too high. And I say actually the price for having them was not too high, and the price for getting rid of them for this country in terms of loss of two things. We throw away huge amounts of talent among the children of the poor who never get the good educations, which in many cases would make them fly. And we also lose that great thing of a thinking elite in the country, not an elite of rich people or an elite of noisy people, but an elite of people who've been taught how to think and who've learnt properly, which the grammar schools provided, a very, very high level of education, which used to be the envy, particularly of the United States, which in my childhood and early teens pillaged our country in something called the brain drain, to try and get people from the grammar schools to go and live and work over there because they hadn't got any equivalent, the USA having a comprehensive school system. And in those days it was said, and I don't believe that this is untrue, that a set of English A-levels in the late 50s and early 60s was worth the same as an American college degree. Who would say that now? But the thing is, the devaluation of our education achieved by the comprehensive revolution has been colossal, but the main sufferers from it are the poor. If you're rich and if you're influential, you can get your children out of the worst of it.
Yes, the comprehensive system has not been a massive success, has it?
I don't think so. I think it'd be very hard to argue that if you made a straight comparison. I think what we need to do is to introduce a television series called Dr. What instead of Doctor Who. Dr. What is the only person in Britain who knows what happened in the past, and he can travel into the past and tell you what actually happened. And in this case, you can go to 1960 and say, look at the schools. Look how much better they are than the ones we have now. Comprehensive schools, to me, are much more frightening than the Daleks.
I tend to agree. Peter, great to see you as always. Peter Hitchens, Mail on Sunday columnist there. He'll be back next Monday.